All right, so are you ready to dive into the blueprint of life? We're taking a deep dive into the evolution of biological information by Christoph Adami. This book is it's amazing. It explores how information shapes every single part of life.
Yeah, Adami does a great job bringing together these two huge fields, information theory and evolutionary biology,
Right.
and it gives us a really good framework for understanding how we go from simple molecules to these intricate systems that we see in nature.
So we're talking about information here, but where do we even begin with something like that?
Well, he starts with the core of evolution. Adami calls it the Darwinian triad: variation, heredity, and selection. These three things are essential. It's like a stool, you know. You take away one leg and the whole thing collapses.
Right. Survival of the fittest. The classic idea.
Exactly, but Adami doesn't stop there. He uses these simulations, sort of like these digital worlds, to show that if you remove even one of these elements, evolution just stops.
So these simulations are like a way to see evolution in action in a controlled environment.
Yes, exactly. He uses strings of digital information, think of it like simplified DNA, and you can see how they either survive and thrive or just die off based on how adaptable they are. But he doesn't just stick to the theoretical stuff. He connects this to real-world research, like the grants work studying finches on the Galapagos Islands.
Oh yeah, I've heard about that. They actually observed evolution happening, right? Like in real time.
Yes, they saw how finch beak sizes changed over time, responding to environmental changes and pressures, and this even led to new species. So we're seeing how important isolation is for speciation. It's amazing. Those islands are like a textbook example of evolution and natural selection playing out.
It's incredible to see these kind of abstract principles of evolution reflected in actual living creatures. It's interesting, though, because when we think about information, we often think about genes, right? Is it too simple to say that genes are the only things carrying biological information?
It is. Adami really highlights how information is woven into every aspect of biology. Think about it. The structure of DNA binding sites, the way that genes are switched on or off, like with the lac operon.
Okay. Can you remind me quickly about the lac operon? It's been a while.
Sure. It's essentially a set of genes found in bacteria, and these genes regulate lactose metabolism. They're activated only when lactose is around, which essentially means that the bacteria are responding to information from their environment to conserve energy.
Oh, wow. That's pretty efficient. But this isn't just happening at the cellular level, right? We were talking about plants and insects communicating earlier.
Absolutely. For example, certain plants release specific scents when insects attack them. And then parasitic wasps, they've evolved to recognize these scents so they can find the plant and the insect that's causing problems. It's like a chemical SOS. This just goes to show how information transfer isn't limited to genes.
So it's like this whole secret language of smells going on between plants and insects. That's incredible. But it really makes you wonder about how this whole dance of information even began in the first place. We're talking about the very beginning of life here.
It's a great question, and Adami explores this through the RNA world hypothesis. It proposes that early life may have relied on non-enzymatic processes to replicate.
Non-enzymatic processes. That sounds complicated.
It's simpler than it sounds. Imagine molecules just interacting and replicating without the complex enzymes that we see in life today. These early systems, these prebiotic systems, they could have been a sort of stepping stone, allowing information to be copied and passed on before more complex cellular machinery evolved.
Ah, okay. So like borrowing your neighbor's tools until you've built your own workshop, that's a pretty smart strategy if you think about it.
Yeah.
Start simple and then over time you can build more complex tools.
Exactly. But the question still remains, how did that initial spark of information even come about? How do we go from random molecules to something that can actually store and transmit information?
Right. It's like, how does information just appear? Was it a bolt of lightning hitting the primordial soup and boom, information?
Thankfully, it's a bit more complex than that. Adami explores some really interesting concepts like biased production rates and non-equilibrium systems. So biased production rates basically means that in the environment of early Earth, certain molecules were just more likely to form than others. It's just chemistry and physics at play.
Okay, biased production rates, that makes sense. But how do we go from molecules forming to information? Like, what makes those molecules meaningful?
Well, that's where non-equilibrium systems come in. Think about early Earth. It was chaotic. Volcanic activity, meteor impacts, it was far from stable. And Adami explains that these types of systems that are far from equilibrium are actually really good at accumulating information.
So the chaos actually helps create order.
In a way, yes. That chaotic environment with constant energy flowing through it, that could have pushed the emergence of those self-replicating molecules, essentially laying the groundwork for this whole information revolution to come about. And to really get a grip on how this complexity comes from these simple rules, Adami introduces this thing called Avida.
Avida, what is that?
Okay, so Avida is like a digital world. Like imagine a virtual petri dish. And in this world, you have these self-replicating programs, and they're evolving and competing with each other. It's like these programs are like digital organisms. They're all trying to get resources and just out-replicate each other.
So it's kind of like those digital strings we were talking about before, but with like an added layer of complexity.
Yeah, exactly. And the really cool thing is that in Avida, you see these complex functions just emerging from these simple programs, even though they weren't actually programmed to do that. So it really shows you how information, when it's under pressure, can lead to some pretty unexpected outcomes.
Wow, that's really cool. Did they find anything unexpected in this Avida world?
Yeah, so one really interesting thing they found was this emergence of parasitism. So some of the programs actually evolved to exploit the work of other programs. They were basically stealing resources instead of actually doing their own computations. And this wasn't something that the researchers had programmed in, it just happened spontaneously, which is amazing. It really shows you how these complex relationships that we see in nature can just come about from these very basic rules.
That's wild. It's like watching a tiny version of evolution right in front of you. Digital parasites and all. But, life isn't all about competition and survival of the fittest. We see cooperation everywhere in nature. How does Adami address that?
He looks at game theory, specifically the prisoner's dilemma. It's a classic example that shows this back and forth between cooperation and competition.
Oh, right. The prisoner's dilemma. I remember that. It's
Yeah.
about trying to figure out the best way to act when you don't know what the other person's going to do.
Right, exactly. It's this scenario, right? Two people, they can cooperate or they can betray each other. And the thing is, betraying always seems like the best option individually. The other person cooperates. But if they both decide to betray each other, they both lose.
So it's like this constant temptation to be selfish, even though everyone would be better off if they just cooperated.
Right. And looking at this, Adami talks about this really successful strategy called tit for tat.
Tit for tat. What's that?
Okay, so it's actually very simple. You start by cooperating, and then each round after that, you just do whatever your opponent did in the round before. If they cooperate, you cooperate. If they betray, you betray.
Oh, okay. So it's like, look, I'm willing to be nice, but if you try to take advantage of me, I'm going to call you out on it.
Yeah. Exactly. So this strategy, it really stresses that idea of reciprocity, building trust, and it turns out tit for tat is super effective at encouraging cooperation and leading to outcomes that are good for both sides, even in situations where betrayal seems like the obvious choice.
So even in this dog-eat-dog world, sometimes being nice can give you an advantage. But do we actually see this happening in the real world? Are bacteria really out there playing tit for tat with each other?
Well, they're not exactly strategizing in the way that we think about it, but those same principles, they definitely apply. We see these examples of reciprocal altruism all over nature, from bacteria that coordinate attacks to, even the cells in our own bodies working together. This cooperation, it's all built on information exchange, and it's crucial for the development of more complex life.
It's amazing to think about these complex communication networks happening at such a small scale. And it ends up influencing the entire planet. It's like a hidden language that's directing everything, from how bacteria act to those intricate interactions happening inside us.
Exactly. And this whole intricate dance between information and cooperation, that leads us to probably the most amazing outcome of biological information: intelligence.
Okay, now we're getting to the really mind-blowing stuff. How does Adami connect information to something as complex as intelligence?
Well, Adami argues that brains, with all of their billions of interconnected neurons, are essentially prediction machines. Think about it. Memory, categorizing things, planning, even consciousness, it all comes down to processing information. We are constantly bombarded with information from the world around us, and our brains, they compare this information to what we already know, and then they make predictions about what's going to happen next. It's like this constant game of guess what happens next.
So our brains are like these supercomputers, constantly analyzing data and making calculated guesses about the world around us.
Essentially, yes. And what's really interesting is that we can actually simulate this. Adami talks about Markov brains.
Markov brains, that sounds like something out of science fiction. What are they?
So basically, they're simplified artificial neural networks that are designed to solve problems in a virtual environment. And they show us that even with these relatively simple structures, you can still get this incredible problem-solving ability.
So we're talking about artificial intelligence that's able to learn and adapt almost like a real brain.
Exactly. And the exciting thing is that these simulated brains, they give us a window into how intelligence works. So by studying how they evolve and figure out solutions, we can actually learn a lot about how our own brains might be doing those same things.
That's amazing. We can simulate the evolution of intelligence in a computer program. It really highlights just how powerful information is. This all seems pretty theoretical, though. Does Adami relate any of this back to the real world? I mean, what are the real implications of this idea that the brain is just an information processor?
So Adami argues that if we really understand how the brain works as an information processor, it could completely change fields like education and artificial intelligence. Like, if we can figure out exactly how our brains learn and adapt, we can design much better ways of teaching and create AI systems that are way more intuitive and adaptable.
So instead of just trying to copy what human thought produces, we could actually replicate the process of thinking. That would be huge.
It would be groundbreaking. But when we start thinking about brains as these information processors, it brings up some really deep questions about consciousness. Like, if our thoughts and emotions, even our sense of self, are all just information being processed, what does that even mean about being human?
It's true. Yeah. That gets into some pretty deep philosophical stuff. Are we all just biological machines running some really, really complex code? It makes you think.
It really does. And while this book, The Evolution of Biological Information, doesn't try to give you all the answers, it definitely gives you a new way to think about these questions. It encourages us to see how everything is connected, how information flows through everything from tiny cells to entire ecosystems.
You know, that reminds me of something we talked about earlier, Adami's idea that information isn't just something that life uses, it's actually what life is. It's not a tool, it's the very essence of being alive. Could you elaborate on that a little more?
Of course, think about it. Every living organism, from the tiniest bacteria to humans, relies on information that's encoded in its DNA. That information determines everything. How our cells are structured to those complex interactions that make up our bodies. And then that information, it's passed down to the next generation. So life continues, and those gradual changes, those adaptations, they happen over time.
So it's like we're all just vessels carrying this ancient code that's been evolving for billions of years.
In a way, yes. And what's even more amazing is that this information, it's not static, it's dynamic. It's constantly being shaped by the environment around it. Every interaction, every single mutation, it can change the information that's passed on, even in a small way. And that's how we get the incredible diversity of life that we see all around us.
You know, when you put it that way, it makes you appreciate just how intricate life is, how everything is connected through this flow of information. It's like this universal language spoken through, I don't know, the rustling of leaves, the sounds of crickets, even the communication happening inside our own bodies.
It's a beautiful way to see it. And that's what Adami does so well in this book. When we start to understand this language of biological information, it gives us this deeper appreciation for the natural world and our place in it.
This deep dive into the evolution of biological information has been incredible. We've explored how information shapes every part of life, from the very first cells to the development of intelligence. And it's so clear that information, it's not just this abstract idea, it's a powerful force. It drives evolution, it shapes our world, and it's at the core of what it means to be alive. So the next time you see the complexity of nature and it blows you away, remember, you're witnessing the power of information, a story that's billions of years in the making and still unfolding every second.